Okay, part 3. I've added some things in here. This one is meant to go there. So, more evidence that governments have the ability to create money is the fact that deficits even exist. If they couldn't make the money to go into deficit, you know, it speaks for itself, really. Just the fact that they're in a deficit means they have spent more money than they have gotten through revenue, taxes, whatever. And obviously, where did that money come from? Where did those Australian dollars come from? And you can have a look at the stats that will tell you each year how much revenue the government makes and how much they spend. And I had a look at it, and I know that when the GFC hit, and then in Australia we had 2 stimulus packages. The bigger one was I think $40 billion, and where we just gave $1,000 to every taxpayer. We just credited them $1,000 straight into their bank account, and that money didn't come from anywhere. And I know that we didn't have 40 billion at the time. I remember looking at the spreadsheet. I have it somewhere, but it doesn't matter, really. Also added these two. Fuck off. Okay. Oh my god. Bank lending and money supply have increased almost exponentially, which is true. I showed you a graph before, part 1, I think. And the fact that it's such a huge increase in lending and money supply every year, it's close to an exponential curve, I'm sure. And it's pretty damn close. Which would mean that the reserve requirements some countries use and the capital adequacy ratios some other countries use do not restrict the lending in any serious way if it increases exponentially. Like, get real. Also, QE, quantitative easing, in America did nothing to increase M2. M2 is the broad money over there. It's different. We use M3 in Australia. They use M2. That's the broad money. And QE was base money, so they pumped. They just made money. The Federal Reserve made money, base money, that was just required to top up the reserve ratio for banks, so that it's saying that the banks have enough base money that they can lend out plenty more money to keep the economy going during the GFC, and it didn't work. It says here, this is Paul Krugman, the Fed does not control the money supply, blah blah blah. Quantitative easing happened here, and I have that somewhere. This one. excess reserves of depository institutions, right? So they put reserves for the commercial banks. This is QE, and you can see that there's nothing here at all because it was done in a they gave them the extra reserves after they had lent out the money and needed to meet the required reserve ratio. And then they gave them heaps of reserves and it didn't increase the lending at all. In fact, the money supply went down. This is M2. This might be a ratio actually. Anyway, it says it best here. The effects of quantitative easing in Japan a few years later, which failed to raise M2, confirmed this conclusion. Sure enough, here's what happened. US M2 as the Fed increased the size of its balance sheet. So governments have the ability to create money. Banks have the ability to create credit, technically not money, credit. And most banks do have some sort of reserve requirement or capital adequacy ratio, which is designed to regulate their lending, but it really does nothing at all to regulate in any real way. And rule number 4 I was getting onto is that interest rates follow the economy. Have here by Richard Werner again. There, Richard Werner and this guy. An empirical examination of the relationship between interest rates and nominal GDP growth. To investigate, we tested the received belief that lower interest rates result in higher growth and higher rates result in lower growth. We find that interest rates follow GDP growth and are consistently positively correlated with growth, so that when the economy grows, then interest rates can grow too. We conclude that conventional monetary policy is fundamentally flawed. So as well as where are we? You can see here, this is the Reserve Bank of Australia website. The cash rate over the years, seemed to be up at 17.5% in 1990. I don't even understand how it was ever that high, considering that's higher than the variable like home loan rate that gets charged. I think the variable home loan rate's what, like, it's always like a little bit above this line, like 7 to 20%, somewhere like maybe like 13% or something, I don't know. And you can see that after the GFC, then our economy was struggling as well, so we had to drop the cash rate, and gradually just keep dropping it and dropping it. There's a gradual decline as the compounding interest-based banking system finally catches up to us, and private debt levels now are at an all-time high. this means is that again, it means that central bank does not have control over not the money supply now, but the economy. So money supply there, economy here. And I want to do one more rule. I want to say that GDP and stock markets are linked to the money supply. I'm not 100% sure that it's definitely perfectly linked, but I'm quite sure there is some sort of correlation. Let's have a look what I got here. What's this one? Analyzing the effect of change in money supply on stock prices. I can't remember about this one. Results, section 4. Let's have a look at results. Stuff all that. And model 1 shows that a positive relationship between changes in the money supply and stock prices. Positive relationship between changes in the money supply and stock prices, as the coefficient for the actual change in M2 is positive. These results support the real activity theorist argument that an increase in money supply increases stock price and vice versa. Okay. Overall, the results support the view of the real activity hypothesis that a positive money supply shock increases stock prices and vice versa. The result also supports the opponents of efficient market hypothesis, which is probably conventional economic theory, not sure though, that anticipated changes in the money supply matter more than unanticipated changes in the money supply in determining stock prices. So there's that, a bit confusing. What else we got? I don't know where or when I got this. Real GDP growth, real M1 growth. I don't know what M1 is in this case. Anyway, what's this? No, not what I want. What about this one? The long run relation between money supply, real GDP and price level. Empirical evidence from Sudan. Probably not the best place to do a test, but whatever. What do we got? What do we got? Directional causation of real GDP and price level is found to be unidirectional from blah blah blah. The analysis suggests that the causation runs from money supply to prices, but price level does not cause money supply naturally. Finally, there is no causality between real GDP and money supply in the case between then. Further, the co-integration analysis established that a real GDP and money supply is found to be co-integrated, suggesting the existence of a long-run relationship. I don't fucking know what that means. What was this one? Oh, this one was good. Effect of money supply on the Dow Jones Industrial Average Stock Index. I remember this one. Yeah. M2, which is broad money in America. Don't worry about that. Dow Jones Industrial Average. This one that goes up here. Generally, you see they follow the same curve. Overall, obviously it goes up and down here. What does it say here? The value of the correlation index, which measures how tight the dependence is between DJ and the money supply, blah, 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 blah. signals a very strong dependence between changes to the money supply and Dow Jones Industrial Average progress. The determination index value equals 85%. Results demonstrate closer correlation with the stock market index money supply measured by the more liquid monetary MZM. Blah blah blah. So that's kind of supporting it, I think. I'm not saying that, as soon as money supply goes up, then the total stock goes up, but it kind of makes sense, right? Like, anyway, let me open. This is Australia. M3, that's broad money. Nominal GDP is what you want. You don't want real GDP. S&P 500, which is similar to Dow Jones for Australia. All Ords is very similar to Dow Jones as well. There's kind of like aggregate stock market measurements, and bank loans here as well. You can see they're all roughly the same, except perhaps this. This looks much more linear. This one looks curved. I think S&P gets used more than All Ords. I think All Ords is kind of out of date. Not out of date, but out of fashion. But also the nominal GDP just seems to go up as money supply goes up, which goes up as bank loans go up. So I think there's some sort of connection between all three. And ramifications of this . That's what that means. Because what is GDP really? It takes all of the transactions made and add them all up, basically. That's my understanding of GDP. And obviously, if you have more money, then that's inflation, and prices generally go up because everyone has more money. So it makes sense just to put the prices up. That's why a loaf of bread is $4 when it used to be 12 cents, right? And so if everyone has more money and the transactions are generally cost more, then GDP would go up. No? That's how I see it. So I just don't see how GDP is a really good measurement of the health of an economy. Anyway, the main points to take away from this is this: Rule 1 and Rule 2. When a bank makes a loan, the money is created. When the loan is repaid, the money is destroyed. And what I don't see, even people who understand this fact, don't talk about interest. Banks charge interest on these loans, and most of these loans are 25, 30-year mortgage loans, and I've heard that if you do pay it over the 30 years, what you're paying off is actually double the amount that you received. So if you get a $500,000 loan, so you got to pay that $500,000 back plus all the interest, and the interest over time will eventually accumulate so that you have to pay an extra 500,000. So you get 500,000, you pay a million back. That's what I've heard. I don't know, you can check yourself on a mortgage calculator, but I know that it's going to be a lot. The interest is going to be massive. Massive. And I remember researching it years ago, and I just can't be bothered anymore. But that should show up on the profit side of a bank's balance sheet, and I don't see that kind of crazy profit showing up on the balance sheets. Obviously they make huge profits already. The CEOs will make, $10 million salary, that kind of thing. Huge amounts of money, but not to the level of what I would be expecting understanding these facts. Because if we have 2.5 trillion, let's say 2 trillion in bank loans and money supply, that means that 2 trillion is all debt, first of all, and then it will need to be paid back, as well as another roughly 2 trillion interest on top of that. And I don't see 2 trillion profit over all the banks. I don't see anywhere close to that. So maybe I guess I'm missing something somehow. But just the fact that they charge any interest on these loans they make, which technically are not loans, seems totally criminal. And I think it's massive financial exploitation, and it's part of the reason, a very big part of the reason why house prices are so massive, especially in Australia. Places like Australia, Norway, Canada, I think China, Hong Kong, they're all basically on the verge of a recession, because they probably avoided, like Australia did, much of the brunt of the GFC, where house prices in America were all dropped back to what they should be. All these places have massive private debt where house prices are, reaching 10 to 15 times the annual income level, whereas before they were maybe only 2 to 6 times the average income level. And obviously the only way these days, if you're in Sydney and the average house price is $1 million, that's not a joke, literally the average house price, maybe 2 or 3 bedroom house, will be $1 million. The only way you're going to be able to afford that is by a loan, right? So that's part of the reason house prices are so big, because people can charge that money because they know that you are going to get that money. You're going to actually be able to have the money because the bank will create the money for you. So first of all, you have to have the money in existence, which is only possible because of credit creation. If we didn't have this credit creation system, it would be impossible to have house prices this high. And obviously the other factor is demand. People are still happy to take these loans, which is crazy, but also there's not a lot of choice. The other choice is living with your parents until you're 40 or 50, which is not how do you have a family and stuff like that? It's not much of a choice. So you have, yes, supply and demand does definitely play into the fact that house prices are so high, but also the fact that the money is even available, which is only possible in the credit creation system we have now. And that's why house prices are so high. And now that the compounding interest banking system we have is finally catching up to us, we will start to see people default on their loans, and that will cause banks to restrict lending. And what lending restrictions will do will be to start to lower the overall money supply, because people are still paying off loans and destroying money, but there's not as much new money being created, which means that it gets harder and harder to pay off the interest plus principals that are already owed. So it is a massive, technically it's a massive Ponzi scheme, where the only way to keep it going is to grow the bank lending exponentially, or not exponentially but compoundingly, because the interest compounds as well. So because the interest compounds, you need the lending / credit creation to also compound to match that, and it's just not going to happen. Technically it could be possible until you reach huge levels of money supply. That's not very efficient, but technically possible, but it's just not going to happen, especially with all the misinformation and misunderstanding people have of the general economy and monetary policy. And so we have a Royal Commission into Banking in Australia at the moment, which is starting to restrict lending, as well as the fact that banks know people won't be able to pay off loans anymore, because other people, there's a lot of mortgage stress going on, and there's some defaulting going on, so banks are more reluctant to lend out. So this reduced lending means that money supply will reduce. When money supply reduces, banking house prices drop, because, like I said, very important factor in house prices is that the money is actually available, and the money will not be available because lending is dropping very much. You can't charge $1 million on a house soon, because people will not be able to get that loan, or they will not be willing to get that loan, or both. But that's a good thing, really. I mean, they say that the economy has grown this week by 2%, house prices have gone up, like that's a good thing. They'll say that on the news like it's a good thing, that house prices in Sydney have gone up 2% this week, blah blah blah, and that they say that's a sign of a growing economy. I don't see how that's really good at all. It just makes it even harder for young people to own homes. It's already basically impossible. Well, not impossible, but you just need a massive loan, a 30-year loan that you're going to spend 30 years paying off, and life's going to be very difficult. You're not going to have a lot of money. In general, that's why just generally living standards, we're living in a time where our technological capabilities are the highest they have ever been, ever in the history of the world. And not only are they the highest, but they're the highest by a long shot. A real long way. Technology has more than doubled just in the last 30 years. And what about the hundreds of years before that? It's increased exponentially, really. That's what happens with technology. You invent something, and then it helps you invent the other thing. And generally, living standards should go up and up and up and up. But what we have is the whole population is working 40, 50, 60-hour weeks, both the mum and the dad, just to be able to live in a house. And I don't even think things were this bad hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago, when all we had to do was build basic shelters and hunt for your food. And it's like we're working harder now than ever before, when we have, it's just crazy. It's absolutely insane. And people just don't seem to realize this. Like, life should not be this hard. I'm not really complaining, saying, oh, my life's hard, but it just should not be this difficult. We just should not have to work this hard. it's rampant financial exploitation. That's what it is. There's some people somewhere just getting fat off all the interest they're earning, and there's no reason, there's no justification that they should be charging any of this interest. It's completely criminal. It's just a joke, really. Complete joke. And then there's huge, it's so hard to make sense of all this. There's huge misinformation, disinformation regarding the economy and money. It's very hard to make sense of it. You have Rule 1 and Rule 2, right? We know this for a fact. Especially Rule 2 makes perfect sense. And just people just don't understand this. Even the prime ministers do not understand this. Or they make out that they don't understand this. And then you have things like, you have all this financial confusing gymnastics going on, probably just to confuse people. You have things like the overnight cash rate, or the discount rate in America, and the federal funds rate. They say, oh, these banks have capital adequacy ratios and reserve requirements, and all this crap, which I understand bits of it, and a lot of it can kind of make sense within the framework of the compound interest banking system we have. But just the fact that the whole system is based on that Ponzi scheme I was talking about means that really it's just a ridiculous system, and we need to put a stop to it, obviously, and maybe at some point we will. When things get bad enough, we'll see what people do. But there's misinformation like the money multiplier, which is what people think. Let's have a look. Which is how people think it works. Money multiplier. Fractional reserve banking, blah, 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 blah. Has been criticised as being misleading. Really? There you go. It's even in Wikipedia. Bank of England have issued detailed reputation of the concept. How it generally goes is that if you have a reserve ratio of 10%, and then someone will give the bank, say, $100, that bank can then lend out 90 of those dollars and keep 10%, which is $10. And then someone else who gets the $90 will give that to someone else, and then that $90 will go into another bank as a deposit, and then that bank can lend out 80 of those dollars or whatever, or 81, and keep $9, which is 10%. And then like this, that's how the money supply grows. That's not how it works. First of all this evidence says that's not how it works. But there is a reserve ratio, but it's more the opposite, where the bank loans out and then just borrows from the central bank what it needs to cover the reserve requirement, and the central bank gives it, kind of thing. So that, yeah. Anyway, it doesn't really matter, because I was going to explain how even if one part of that worked, then the other part wouldn't work, but it just doesn't matter. The whole thing's obviously wrong. We have evidence that money multiplier is total misinformation. This is how it really works. Comments or questions? Thanks.